Mildred McMillan let out a yelp so sharp it startled a flock of crows. Then her aluminum ladder went clattering into my rose bushes, sparks flying off her polyester pantsuit like a 4th of July sparkler. Freeze frame. Yep, that's our HOA president. And yes, she just got zapped by my fence. What she thought was an unauthorized structure turned out to be a very legal and very electrified deterrent for nosy ladder climbers. Now, before you judge me, just know, I warned her. She just didn't realize the squirrels weren't the only ones I was trying to keep out. Let's rewind. It all started, as these things often do, with a fence. Not just any fence, mind you, but 6 feet of glorious, HOA-approved cedar-stained privacy. I'd saved for it, meticulously researched the bylaws, filed the permits, and hired professionals. It was perfect. My little slice of backyard paradise in what I'd naively assumed was a reasonably normal suburban enclave. I'm an electrical engineer, you see. Details, precision, adherence to codes, these are things I live by, both professionally and personally. My property line was surveyed, my setbacks were immaculate, and my fence was, by every conceivable metric, unassailably correct. Or so I thought. Enter Mildred McMillan, president of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association, a woman who moved through the neighborhood with the grim determination of a heat-seeking missile locked onto any perceived infraction of her personally amended, unwritten rulebook. Mildred was, to put it mildly, a character. Picture a woman built like a Sherman tank, perpetually clad in boxy, shoulder-padded pantsuits in shades of beige that somehow managed to be both boring and aggressive. Her hair was a rigidly sprayed helmet, her lipstick a slash of violent cerise, and her eyes, small and suspicious, missed nothing, especially if it could be twisted into a violation. She drove a pristine, white Cadillac Escalade that seemed to occupy 2 parking spaces by sheer force of will, and treated the HOA common areas like her personal fiefdom. My previous interactions with Mildred had been minor skirmishes. A passive-aggressive note about the precise Pantone shade of my welcome mat. Apparently autumn sunset was too evocative for Oakhaven's delicate sensibilities. A verbal warning about my grass being a 1/4 inch too high, the day before my lawn service was due. Standard HOA busybody stuff. Annoying, but manageable. But the fence apparently broke her. About a week after my beautiful new bastion of solitude was completed, I was enjoying a quiet Saturday morning coffee on my patio, reveling in the absence of prying eyes from the adjacent common pathway. That's when I saw it. First, the glint of aluminum over the top of my fence, then a wobble, and finally, the unmistakable silhouette of Mildred McMillan's helmet hair, slowly rising like a particularly judgmental submarine periscope. She was on a ladder, an old, rickety-looking aluminum extension ladder, planted firmly on the common grass strip that ran alongside my property, peering directly into my yard. I nearly choked on my coffee. I stormed out, righteous indignation bubbling. "Mildred, what in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing?" I yelled, trying to keep my voice from shaking with pure rage. She looked down, not a flicker of surprise or shame on her face, just that smug, appraising stare. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she chirped, as if this were the most normal thing in the world, just conducting a routine compliance check. Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 3, Maintenance of Aesthetic Standards, Rear-Facing Properties. I knew the bylaws backwards and forwards by this point. There is absolutely nothing in the bylaws that permits you to erect a ladder and spy into my private property, Mildred. That common area is for passage, not for setting up your personal surveillance tower. Her smile was tight, condescending. "Oh, I think you'll find the board has broad discretion in interpreting how best to monitor compliance. This vantage point is necessary to ensure all residents are adhering to the covenants, especially those pertaining to unauthorized structures, landscaping modifications, and general tidiness which might impact common area views." I felt my blood pressure spike. Unauthorized structures? General tidiness? Mildred, I just had this fence permitted and approved by your board. And my yard is immaculate." She made a little show of adjusting her binoculars, which I now noticed were hanging around her neck. "We'll be the judge of that, Mr. Harrison. Consider this a proactive measure. And frankly, what goes on in your backyard is hardly private if it violates community standards that impact us all." She actually winked, a horrifying reptilian gesture. I stood there, gobsmacked by the sheer audacity. This wasn't just an overreach, it was a declaration of war. The ladder wasn't a one-time thing, it became a fixture. Almost every other day, there she'd be, perched like a vulture in discount polyester, sometimes scribbling in a little notebook, other times just watching. The psychological toll was immense. I couldn't relax in my own yard. My wife, Sarah, started drawing the blinds even on sunny days. It felt like being under siege. I tried reasoning with other board members. Most were clearly terrified of Mildred, offering me sympathetic, but ultimately useless shrugs. One of them, a meek fellow named Arthur Jenkins who always looked like he was apologizing for breathing, actually whispered, "She gets an idea in her head, and there's no stopping her. Best to just try to ignore it." Ignore it? She was literally 10 feet up in the air gawking at my breakfast. Soon, the warnings started. Little typed notes, unsigned but clearly from her, tucked into my mailbox. Observed, unkempt rosebush, eastern perimeter. Patio furniture arrangement, appears cluttered from pathway vantage point. Child's inflatable pool, blue, garish, visible. Reminder, temporary items must be stored out of sight after use. The pool had been up for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon for my niece's visit. This woman was inventing infractions based on fleeting glimpses into my life. My carefully constructed sanctuary had become a panopticon, with Warden Macmillan as its ever-vigilant eye. The other neighbors? Some offered quiet words of support, admitting Mildred had terrorized them for years over everything from mailbox font to the species of bird feeders they were allowed. But no one wanted to stick their neck out. It became chillingly clear that traditional methods, reasoned debate, appeals to the HOA board, even polite requests, were utterly futile against Hurricane Mildred. She was a force of nature, convinced of her divine right to snoop. And as an engineer, someone who believed in systems and solutions, I felt a particular kind of fury building. This wasn't just an invasion of privacy, it was an insult to logic itself. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I couldn't let this stand. Mildred Macmillan had picked the wrong backyard to surveil, and the wrong engineer to provoke. She just didn't know it yet. But her reign of terror over my 6-foot cedar fence was about to hit a very unexpected, very specific, technical snag. The ladder had to go. And Mildred, metaphorically and perhaps even a little bit literally, was going to get a serious jolt. My frustration had reached a boiling point, a constant, simmering rage just beneath the surface. Every time I saw that gleaming aluminum ladder, its rungs a metallic sneer over my fence line, my teeth would grind. This wasn't just about the ladder anymore, it was about the principle. Mildred Macmillan had effectively annexed a visual slice of my property, my life, and she'd done it with the smug assurance of a petty dictator. I recounted my woes to anyone who would listen, usually my long-suffering wife Sarah, who was now suggesting we install blackout curtains on the patio doors. "It's like living next to a very nosy, very badly dressed lighthouse keeper," she'd said, accurately capturing the bizarre blend of intrusion and aesthetic offense. I started documenting everything. Times, dates, photos of Mildred on her perch, copies of her ridiculous infraction notices, which were always delivered with an air of someone bestowing damning stone tablets. I reread the HOA rupees, the bylaws, the county ordinances, looking for any loophole, any clause I could weaponize. My engineering brain was whirring, analyzing the problem, seeking a system flaw in Mildred's operational dominance. She had everyone cowed. The other board members were like frightened sheep, bleeding their assent to her every decree. Old Man Hemlock next door, who once got a formal warning for the aggressive political implications of his garden gnome's pointed hat, just shook his head when I asked for support. "Son," he'd rasped. Mildred Macmillan once tried to fine the squirrels for burying nuts in the common area flower beds. You don't reason with that kind of crazy. You just pray it aims elsewhere. This wasn't encouraging. It was during one particularly egregious ladder session. Mildred had brought a clipboard and was making what appeared to be a detailed inventory of my potted herbs that my Grandpa Joe decided to come for his scheduled weekly visit. Grandpa Joe was a legend. 80 years young, a retired Air Force electrical engineer himself, with a mind still as sharp as a tack and a gleam in his eye that hinted at a lifetime of well-intentioned mischief. He'd spent his career designing and troubleshooting complex radar systems, and he approached most of life's absurdities with a calm, analytical curiosity, especially when they involved human folly. He found Mildred's ladder vigil less outrageous and more diagnostically interesting. He arrived just as Mildred was adjusting her stance for a better view of what I assumed she'd label my non-compliant basil. Grandpa Joe watched her for a solid 5 minutes, stroking his chin, a faint smile playing on his lips. He was a man of few words initially, preferring observation. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes twinkling. "Well, now?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's quite the dedicated public servant you've got there. Reminds me of old Sergeant Wilkins trying to spot contraband chewing gum in the barracks from the top of a locker. Equally effective, I imagine." He observed Mildred's routine with professional interest. Her predictability was her weakness, he noted. She always used the same aging aluminum ladder, always propped it in roughly the same spot, always spent a predictable amount of time peering before descending to make her little notes. She even had a specific way she gripped the rails. "She's sloppy, complacent," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Assumes her position makes her untouchable. Classic, amateur mistake." That evening, after Mildred had finally descended from her throne of aluminum and judgment, Grandpa Joe and I sat on my patio, the offensive ladder still leaning against the common area fence just beyond my property line, taunting me. "So," Grandpa said, swirling the ice in his lemonade, "this Mildred, she's impervious to reason. The board's a rubber stamp, and direct confrontation just fuels her fire. Legal action slow and expensive. A bigger fence? She'd probably just get a taller ladder or a cherry picker. Counter surveillance with a spotlight? Tempting, but escalates messily." We tossed around a few more impractical ideas. A sprinkler system accidentally misfiring, attracting a flock of particularly vocal and messy birds to the area above her ladder. "What if," Grandpa said, a slow, deliberate grin spreading across his face, "that ladder just wasn't a very comfortable place to be anymore? What if it developed a certain negative energy?" My engineer ears perked up. "Negative energy, Grandpa? You going mystical on me?" He chuckled. "Not mystical, son. Electrical. Highly unpleasant, shall we say, but not permanently damaging. A strong suggestion to relocate her activities." My own background in electrical engineering suddenly snapped into focus with his. We were on the same wavelength. The vague idea began to solidify. This wasn't about hurting her, not seriously. This was about behavior modification through applied science. We weren't talking booby traps, nothing that would cause lasting harm or bring the full weight of the law down on us. This needed to be elegant, targeted, and, if possible, imbued with a certain delicious irony. The plan began to form, piece by piece, like one of Grandpa's complex circuit diagrams. "The beauty of an aluminum ladder," he pointed out, "is its conductivity." We discussed low-power, high-voltage fence chargers, the kind used for livestock. Unpleasant, certainly, but designed to deter, not to maim. The key would be the application, making it so her ladder, in her chosen spying spot, became the source of her discomfort. The legalities were a concern. I spent a few hours online that night, researching trespassing, liability, and the fine line between protecting your property and, well, torturing your HOA president. The latter was technically on common ground, but her activity was a direct invasion of my privacy. Leaning over my fence, sometimes even her ladder would touch my fence posts as she adjusted it. That gave me an idea. "Grandpa, I said the next morning. What if we focus on our fence line? We have the right to protect our property. What if we install a very discreet animal deterrent along the top rail of our fence on our side? Grandpa's eyes lit up, like for squirrels or raccoons trying to climb over. Exactly, I said. A very fine, almost invisible wire. If her metal ladder happens to make contact with that wire while she's on it. Grandpa finished my thought. And she happens to be well grounded, say by standing on slightly damp earth after the morning dew, or if the ladder itself provides a good path to ground through her. Well, she might find her surveillance duties electrifyingly interrupted. The plan felt right. It was proactive, not reactive in a destructive way. It used her own tool against her. It had an element of beautiful, understated karmic justice. We decided to install a critter deterrent for some, entirely fictional for now, prized rose bushes. I was planning to plant right along that fence line. Something a little more robust than your average garden spray was clearly needed for these very special, very hypothetical roses. The next day, I made a point of loudly discussing my new anti-squirrel fence topper plans with Sarah, while I knew Mildred was within earshot during one of her regular prowls along the pathway, sans ladder for the moment. Perhaps plotting. Yes, dear, I'd said, my voice carrying. Those heirloom roses need serious protection. Got to get that special deterrent wire up. Heard it gives those pesky varmints quite a little nip if they try to climb over. Mildred naturally paused her power walk, her ears practically swiveling. She offered no comment, just a slightly more intense version of her usual suspicious glare before striding off. Perfect. The seed was planted. She'd been obliquely warned about a new installation along the fence. Grandpa Joe rubbed his hands together with a distinctly impish glee. Phase 1, my boy, he said. She's been advised of potential fence enhancements. Now for the fun part. The feeling was intoxicating. After weeks of feeling helpless and violated, we were finally taking action, turning the tables using logic, a bit of ingenuity, and the fundamental principles of electricity. Mildred McMillan was about to learn that while she might rule the HOA with an iron fist, iron, or in her case, aluminum, could also be an excellent conductor. The next few days were a delightful exercise in clandestine engineering, a covert operation conducted under the guise of routine yard work. Grandpa Joe, with his decades of experience tinkering with electronics, was in his absolute element, and I found myself rediscovering a childlike joy in problem-solving, a far cry from my usual world of industrial control systems and high-voltage power distribution. Our critter deterrent system for the non-existent prized roses needed to be both effective and virtually invisible, at least to a casual observer or a ladder-wielding HOA president not specifically looking for it. We sourced a standard agricultural electric fence energizer, one designed for small livestock like sheep or goats. These units deliver a high-voltage pulse, but with very low amperage and for a very short duration. It's enough to give a sharp, startling shock, a jolt that makes you yelp and jump back, but it's not designed to cause serious injury to a healthy adult. That was crucial. Our goal was deterrence, a powerful negative reinforcement, not actual harm. The beauty of it was its simplicity. The energizer would be hidden discreetly in my shed, powered by a standard outlet. From there, we ran a thin insulated lead wire, buried shallowly along the base of the fence on my side. Completely concealed beneath a new layer of mulch, I was freshening up. The wire then ran up a corner fence post, tucked neatly into the groove where the panels met the post, virtually undetectable. The real artistry, Grandpa declared, was in the delivery mechanism. We couldn't electrify the entire fence. That would be problematic and overkill. We needed to ensure only Mildred's ladder, in its specific intrusive placement, received the special treatment. Along the very top edge of my 6-foot cedar fence, directly on my side, we strung an incredibly fine, high-tensile steel wire, the kind almost as thin as fishing line but exceptionally strong. It was stretched taut between small, insulated standoffs that were themselves almost invisible against the dark stain of the cedar. To anyone not inspecting the top millimeter of my fence with a magnifying glass, it would be completely unnoticed. The energizer would pulse voltage into this wire. Now, for the circuit to complete and deliver a shock, two things needed to happen. Something conductive had to touch this fine wire, and that something, or someone touching it, had to be grounded. Mildred's aluminum ladder, when she leaned it against my fence as she always did to get the best spying angle, would be the something conductive. Her feet on the damp common area grass, or even just her body's capacitance providing a path to ground for a brief jolt, would complete the circuit if she touched the ladder. Grandpa Joe was meticulous. The key, he explained, humming an old service ditty, is good contact and good ground. Aluminum is perfect. And that woman, bless her nosy heart, always plants that ladder like she's staking a claim. We even did some reconnaissance. After Mildred had retired for the evening, we noted the exact spots where her ladder typically scuffed against the top of my fence. We ensured our fine wire was optimally positioned for contact right there. We also accidentally overwatered a small patch of grass on the common area side, right where she usually placed the ladder's feet, ensuring a slightly damper, more conductive ground. Just helping nature along. Testing was paramount. We used a fence tester, a little device with a light that flashes to indicate current. With the energizer on, the top wire pulsed merrily. Then Grandpa, wearing thick rubber work gloves and insulated boots, carefully leaned a spare aluminum pole, our ladder surrogate, against the fence, ensuring it made contact with the fine wire. He then used a grounding rod connected to a voltmeter to touch the pole. The voltmeter spiked exactly as expected with each pulse. "She'll get a tingle, all right," Grandpa declared with immense satisfaction. A real aha moment, if you will. We also discussed legalities again. We were installing a deterrent on our own property. The fine wire was entirely on my side of the fence line. If Mildred's ladder trespassed into my airspace and made contact, that was on her. And to be extra cautious, and to lay the groundwork for our plausible deniability and future arguments if needed, I printed up a few very small, discreet warning signs. They were about the size of a business card, with tiny lettering, "Caution, electric animal deterrent active." I didn't put them up yet. Those were for after the first incident, to show we'd taken reasonable steps once we realized there was a potential for contact. For now, the surprise was part of the strategy. The setup took the better part of an afternoon, disguised as me and Grandpa puttering around, seemingly adjusting sprinklers and tidying the fence line. Any curious neighbor, even Mildred if she'd been observing from afar, would have seen nothing amiss. The anticipation was thick. We felt like naughty schoolboys setting up an elaborate prank, but with the righteous fury of homeowners pushed too far. That evening, Sarah, who had been kept appraised of Project Zap Mildred, as Grandpa gleefully nicknamed it, was a bundle of nerves and excitement. "Are you sure this is okay?" she asked, peering out the window at the now innocuous-looking fence. "Perfectly okay, my dear," Grandpa assured her. "We're just helping Mrs. McMillan understand the concept of personal space using universally understood feedback mechanisms. I have to admit, a part of me, the engineer, was incredibly proud of our little system. It was elegant, efficient, and specifically targeted. The other part of me, the homeowner who just wanted to enjoy his coffee in peace, was just desperate for it to work. The dry runs were complete. The components were hidden. The stage was set. All we needed was for our leading lady, Warden Mildred McMillan, to take her position for her next command performance on the ladder of looming dread. We didn't have to wait long. The next morning, right on schedule, as I was making coffee, Sarah hissed from the living room window, "She's here, and she's got the ladder." My heart gave a little thump. Showtime. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn, painting stripes through the slats of my perfectly legal, perfectly private cedar fence. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, and not just metaphorically. Grandpa Joe was stationed at the kitchen window, which offered a slightly obscured, but adequate view of the impending drama zone, armed with a pair of his old bird-watching binoculars. Sarah was hovering nervously nearby, wringing her hands but with a glint of anticipation in her eyes. I was trying to appear nonchalant, sipping my coffee, but my insides were a knot of excitement and a tiny flicker of apprehension. What if it didn't work? What if she had rubber-soled boots and insulated gloves? What if a squirrel actually did try to climb it first and gave the game away? My engineering mind raced through contingency scenarios. Mildred Macmillan approached her task with the grim determination she always displayed. The rickety aluminum extension ladder was dragged into position, its metallic feet scraping on the concrete pathway, before thudding onto the slightly damp patch of common grass we'd so thoughtfully pre-irrigated. She extended it with a series of practiced, noisy clicks and clacks, the sound echoing in the quiet morning air like the loading of some medieval siege weapon. Then, with a grunt, she heaved it up, leaning it directly against my fence, right where our calculations predicted and hoped it would make firm contact with our nearly invisible top-wired deterrent. My breath hitched. Grandpa adjusted his binoculars. "And contact looks good," he murmured, like a NASA controller during a docking maneuver. "Rungs appear to be well connected with the upper guide wire. Subject is ascending." Mildred, huffing slightly, began her climb. 1 rung, 2 rungs, her formidable form silhouetted against the bright sky. She reached her usual surveillance altitude, about 3/4 of the way up, high enough to peer comfortably into my entire backyard. She paused, adjusted her ever-present, disapproving expression, and reached for the small, spiral-bound notepad and pencil she always tucked into her pantsuit pocket. This was it. Her hand, free of the notepad for a moment, settled onto one of the aluminum side rails of the ladder for balance. The Energizer, safely tucked away in my shed, was set to deliver a pulse every 1.2 seconds. We waited. 1 pulse. Nothing. Had we miscalculated the grounding? My stomach sank. Another pulse was due. And then, the shriek that erupted from Mildred Macmillan was a glorious, multi-octave symphony of surprise, pain, and utter indignation. It wasn't a scream of terror, more a yelp of someone who's just sat on a very surprised cat or grabbed a live spark plug. Her hand flew off the ladder rail as if it had been bitten. The notepad and pencil went flying, arcing gracefully through the air before landing with a clatter on the pathway. Mildred herself executed a frantic wobbling dance on the rungs, her eyes wide with disbelief. She scrambled, rather ungracefully for a woman of her usual rigid composure, back down the ladder, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste. Her descent was considerably faster than her ascent. Grandpa let out a snort of laughter he quickly tried to stifle into a cough. Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes sparkling. I fought to keep a straight face, aiming for an expression of mild, neighborly concern. Mildred stood at the base of the ladder, panting, rubbing her hand, and staring at the inanimate object with a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal, as if the ladder itself had personally assaulted her. She cautiously reached out a finger and tapped one of the rungs. Yep! Another smaller jolt, another yelp. This was better than we could have hoped. She snatched her hand back, looking wildly around, her gaze sweeping across my fence, then my windows. I decided it was time for my appearance. I strolled out onto my patio, coffee cup in hand, projecting an air of innocent curiosity. "Mildred, is everything all right over there?" Sounded like a cat fight. Mildred spun around, her face flushed a shade of puce that clashed horribly with her beige pantsuit. "Harrison!" she sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at her ladder, then at my fence. Your fence! It attacked me. It shocked me." I adopted my most puzzled expression. "My fence shocked you, Mildred? That's highly unusual. It's a wooden fence. Are you sure you didn't just get a bit of static electricity? It can be quite surprising sometimes." Grandpa chose this moment to amble out, looking thoughtful. "Static," he mused, loud enough for her to hear. "Or perhaps you snagged yourself on a loose wire, Mildred. Old ladders like that, sometimes bits of wire from who knows where get caught up in them. Best to be careful. Mildred was not buying the static electricity theory. It was a shock, a jolt, from your property. She was almost vibrating with rage. I felt it, twice. You've done something. You've booby-trapped your fence. Booby-trapped? I feigned offense. Mildred, that's a serious accusation. We haven't done anything to the fence other than admire its HOA-approved beauty. Perhaps your ladder is faulty? Or maybe you touched something else while you were up there. She glared, her eyes narrowing. This isn't over, Harrison. I know you're behind this. She then did something truly remarkable. She called the HOA's designated security patrol, which consisted of Barry, a retired mall cop who mostly issued parking tickets for cars left on the street overnight, and whose main qualification seemed to be owning a slightly ill-fitting navy blue blazer. Barry arrived in his golf cart, lights unnecessarily flashing, looking important. Mildred, now slightly more composed but still seething, recounted her tale of electrocution by malicious fence. Barry listened, his expression growing increasingly bewildered. I calmly explained my side. Officer Barry, I began, giving him his preferred, unearned title. Mrs. McMillan was on her ladder, looking into my yard again. She claims she received a static shock. As you can see, it's a standard wooden fence. Perhaps she could explain why she was on a ladder peering into my private property in the first place. Barry looked from Mildred to the ladder, then to my fence, then back to Mildred. He was clearly out of his depth. Well, Mildred, he began hesitantly. Are you sure it wasn't just, static? It was not static, Barry, you imbecile, Mildred shrieked, her composure shattering again. It was an electrical shock. He's done something to his fence to target me. At this point, I decided to deploy the next phase. Actually, Officer Barry, I said smoothly, now that Mrs. McMillan mentions electricity, Sarah and I did recently install a very low-power electric animal deterrent along the top inside edge of our fence. We're planning to put in some rather valuable heirloom roses, and the squirrels and raccoons around here are terrible. It's a perfectly legal, standard agricultural unit. Very low amperage. Just gives a little nip. We put up warning signs this morning, in fact. I pointed to the tiny, almost invisible signs I'd strategically placed a couple of hours earlier, after confirming Mildred had left the area post-shock. Perhaps Mrs. McMillan's aluminum ladder accidentally made contact with the wire? It's entirely on my property, of course. She wouldn't have been trespassing her ladder into my airspace, would she? Barry looked relieved to have a plausible, non-confrontational explanation. He squinted at my fence, then at one of the tiny signs I indicated. Oh, an animal deterrent, he said, nodding sagely. Right. Well, Mildred, if your ladder touched that and it's on his property, that's probably what happened. You should be more careful where you put your ladder, especially if it's metal. Mildred's face was a study in apoplectic fury. She was being dismissed. Her pain, her accusation, her authority all crumbling. This is an outrage. It's a deliberate attack, she insisted, but her voice lacked its usual commanding boom. Barry just shrugged, clearly wanting this to be over. Can't see any violation here, Mildred. He's allowed to protect his plants on his own property. Maybe just observe from ground level from now on? He gave her a weak, placating smile and practically fled in his golf cart. Mildred stared at the ladder, then at me, then back at the ladder as if it were a venomous snake. Without another word, she grabbed it, folded it with a series of angry metallic shrieks, and practically dragged it away down the path, muttering threats under her breath about lawyers, board meetings, and eternal damnation for cheeky engineers. Grandpa Joe and I exchanged a silent, victorious look. The ladder, for the first time in weeks, was gone. My backyard felt breathable again. The silence from Mildred's usual spying perch was deafeningly beautiful. Phase 2 complete. But we knew Mildred. This was far from over. She wasn't the type to take a jolt lying down, especially not a public one. The war was won, but the battle for lasting peace was heading for the HOA boardroom. The following week was eerily quiet. The ominous silhouette of Mildred McMillan's ladder no longer blotted out the morning sun over my fence. It was a blissful, if temporary, reprieve. I actually enjoyed my coffee on the patio without feeling like I was an unwilling subject in a behavioral science experiment. Sarah started leaving the blinds open again. Grandpa Joe, having overseen the successful field test of Project Zapped Mildred, returned to his own home, but not before a hearty handshake and a conspiratorial wink. "Keep those warning signs visible, son," he'd advised, "and document everything. That woman's got more pride than sense, and she'll be back, likely with reinforcements." He was, as usual, spot on. The tranquility was shattered precisely 1 week later by a crisply folded, official-looking letter, hand-delivered to my mailbox by none other than Arthur Jenkins, the tremulous board secretary. Arthur practically threw the envelope at me and scurried away like a startled field mouse, muttering apologies I couldn't quite decipher. The letter was a summons. An emergency HOA board meeting had been called. Agenda item: formal complaint by President McMillan regarding hazardous property modifications and homeowner misconduct, Harrison residence. Beneath it, in Mildred's unmistakable aggressive scrawl, was added, "and potential assault." Assault! The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I immediately called Grandpa Joe. "She's escalating to the boardroom, Grandpa. Claiming assault now, among other things." He chuckled. Predictable. Pride's a powerful motivator, especially when it's been publicly singed. "Don't you worry, son. Stick to the facts. You have every right to protect your property." She was the one trespassing with her oversized curiosity. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse buzzed with an unusual energy. These meetings were typically dreary affairs, sparsely attended by residents forced to listen to Mildred drone on about sprinkler schedules or the appropriate height for holiday lawn inflatables. Tonight, however, word had clearly spread. The room was packed. Neighbors I barely knew were there, their faces a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Mildred sat at the head of the board table, looking like a thundercloud in a navy blue power suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her usual cronies, the enabling board members, flanked her. Agnes Periwinkle, whose primary contribution was always agreeing loudly with Mildred, and Bob, the nodder Henderson, who seemed to communicate exclusively through vigorous head affirmations whenever Mildred spoke. Arthur Jenkins sat at the end, nervously shuffling papers, avoiding everyone's gaze. Sarah was by my side, a pillar of calm support, though I could feel the tension radiating from her. I had my binder, photos of Mildred on the ladder, copies of her harassing notes, printouts of county ordinances regarding privacy and property rights, literature on low-voltage electric animal deterrence, and a fresh, close-up photo of my now very clearly displayed warning signs. Mildred opened the meeting with a dramatic flair, her voice quivering with manufactured indignation. "Fellow residents, board members," she began, her gaze sweeping the room, "we are here tonight to address a grave matter. A deliberate, malicious act perpetrated against my person, and by extension, against this entire community and the sanctity of our bylaws, by Mr. Harrison." She recounted her version of the electrocution incident, painting herself as a diligent public servant, merely attempting to uphold community standards when she was viciously attacked by a high-voltage booby trap on my fence. She described the shock with dramatic embellishments, implying she was lucky to be alive. She accused me of creating a dangerous hazard, not just to her, but to children and pets. "This was not an accident," she declared, thumping the table. "This was a calculated assault, designed to intimidate me, to stop me from carrying out my sworn duties as your president." When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice calm and measured. I stood, opened my binder, and addressed the board and the assembled residents. "Thank you, Madam President, board members, neighbors. I'd like to address these serious accusations with facts, not theatrics." I started by presenting the photos of Mildred on her ladder, day after day, peering into my yard. "For weeks," I explained, "Mrs. McMillan has used this ladder, placed on common property, to engage in what can only be described as a persistent and unwelcome surveillance of my private backyard. This activity is not sanctioned by any HOA bylaw, and constitutes a clear invasion of my family's privacy. A murmur went through the crowd. Several people nodded. I have copies of numerous unsolicited compliance notes I received, detailing observations Mrs. Macmillan could only have made from this elevated, intrusive vantage point. I passed copies around. Then, I moved to the assault. Regarding the incident where Mrs. Macmillan claimed she was shocked, I continued. Let me be perfectly clear. My family recently decided to plant some valuable heirloom roses along our fence line. I gestured to a beautiful nursery catalog photo of the, still entirely hypothetical, roses I'd inserted into my binder. To protect this investment from squirrels and raccoons, we installed a standard, commercially available, low-voltage electric animal deterrent system. This system is entirely on my property. It delivers a mild, pulsed shock, designed to deter small animals, not harm them. It is perfectly legal and widely used. I then showed the close-up photos of the tiny warning signs. After we installed the system, and realizing that Mrs. Macmillan frequently placed her aluminum ladder in contact with our fence, we posted these warning signs. They are small, as per aesthetic guidelines, but clear. I held one up. Caution. Electric animal deterrent active. Mildred sputtered. Those signs weren't there when it happened. Actually, Mildred, I corrected gently. They were put up very shortly after the initial installation, and certainly before you tried to touch the ladder a second time, or before Officer Barry arrived. Prudent, wouldn't you agree? Once we realized there was a potential for unintended contact from, say, a carelessly placed metal ladder? I saw a few smiles flicker in the audience. If Mrs. Macmillan received a shock, I stated, looking directly at her, it was because she chose to ignore verbal warnings about potential new fence line installations, disregarded visible signage, and placed her conductive aluminum ladder in direct contact with a clearly marked deterrent system on my private property, while trespassing her equipment into my airspace. This wasn't an assault. It was an unfortunate consequence of her own actions while engaged in unauthorized surveillance. Bob the Nodder actually stopped nodding for a moment, looking confused. Agnes Periwinkle was frowning. Old Man Hemlock, from the back, called out, "She was always looking in people's yards. About time someone did something." Several amens and hears followed. Mildred's face was becoming a terrifying shade of purple. "This is outrageous. He admits it. He electrified the fence to get me." "To be precise, Mildred," I said, "we activated a deterrent for animals on our property. Your ladder touching it was an unforeseen, though perhaps in hindsight, not entirely unpredictable consequence of your diligence." I then played my trump card. I'd consulted a lawyer friend who specialized in HOA disputes. "I also have here," I said, pulling out another document, "a legal opinion which states that continuous, unwarranted surveillance from an elevated position into a private yard can constitute harassment and invasion of privacy, potentially opening the HOA and individuals involved to civil liability." I paused to let that sink in. My family simply wants to enjoy our home in peace, without being subjected to constant scrutiny from a ladder. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. Mildred's bluster was deflating. The board members were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Even her staunchest supporters seemed hesitant. Finally, Mrs. Henderson, Bob the Nodder's wife, who rarely spoke, raised her hand. "Mildred," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, "my Bob has a pacemaker. Are you absolutely sure this deterrent is safe if someone accidentally touched it who wasn't, well, you?" Before Mildred could launch into another tirade, I quickly responded, "Absolutely, Mrs. Henderson. These units are designed with safety in mind. The amperage is extremely low. It's the brief, high-voltage pulse that startles. It wouldn't interfere with a pacemaker from a brief, accidental touch. We specifically chose the safest, smallest, effective model. It's about the same jolt you might get from a strong static shock on a dry day, just more pointed." This seemed to reassure several people. The discussion then devolved. Several other residents, emboldened, started to voice their own grievances about Mildred's overreach, her arbitrary fines, her dictatorial style. The meeting was slipping away from her. She tried to regain control, banging her gavel, which was actually just a small wooden meat tenderizer she'd brought from home. But it was too late. The tide had turned. Arthur Jenkins, seeing his moment, finally spoke up. "Perhaps," he squeaked, then cleared his throat and spoke more firmly. "Perhaps the board should review the guidelines on presidential conduct and privacy." It was a small crack, but it was enough. The board, smelling blood in the water and perhaps fearing that legal liability I dangled, voted to table Mildred's complaint pending further investigation and a review of surveillance protocols. It was a bureaucratic death sentence for her crusade. Mildred sat there, stunned into silence, her face a mask of disbelief. Her reign, if not over, was seriously damaged. The neighbors were actually smiling. As we left, several people quietly thanked me. Old Man Hemlock gave me a thumbs up. The legend of the electrified ladder was already being whispered. And the best part? My backyard was finally, truly, my own again. The aftermath of that tumultuous HOA meeting was nothing short of revolutionary for Oakhaven Estates. Mildred McMillan, visibly diminished and publicly challenged, seemed to shrink. Her usual imperious swagger was replaced by a sullen, resentful shuffle. The latter, her scepter of suburban tyranny, vanished completely and was never seen again. It was as if the mere memory of that embarrassing jolt, coupled with the united front of disgruntled neighbors and the thinly veiled threat of legal action, had finally penetrated her fortress of entitlement. The further investigation into her complaint quietly fizzled out, as did any review of surveillance protocols, mostly because no one on the board wanted to touch the subject with a 10-foot, non-conductive pole. The status quo had been monumentally shifted, not by a committee or a vote, but by a well-placed, low-amp shock and a community that had finally found its voice. Over the next few weeks, a subtle but significant change rippled through the neighborhood. People started planting flowers that weren't on Mildred's approved list of inoffensive perennials. A rogue wind chime or two appeared. Someone even dared to paint their front door a cheerful but tasteful shade of blue without pre-approval. The fear that had gripped Oakhaven for so long began to dissipate. It turned out my little act of electrical engineering meets behavioral psychology had broader implications. Emboldened by the latter incident, a small group of homeowners, myself included, began to scrutinize the HOA's finances and operating procedures. Mildred, it turned out, had been running the HOA like her personal piggy bank for years, with questionable expenditures on landscaping consultations that always seemed to involve her nephew's struggling lawn care business and administrative fees that were suspiciously vague. The forensic accounting skills of Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street, a retired CPA who'd always found Mildred insufferable, proved invaluable. Armed with actual data and clear evidence of mismanagement and a whiff of nepotism, we called for another HOA meeting. This time, it wasn't about me. It was about Mildred's fitness to lead. The evidence was damning. The community, no longer intimidated, overwhelmingly supported a vote of no confidence. Mildred McMillan was unceremoniously stripped of her presidency. She didn't even attend the meeting where her fate was sealed, sending a terse, typo-riddled resignation letter instead. Her reign of beige terror was officially over. The new HOA board was comprised of reasonable people, actual neighbors who wanted a pleasant, well-maintained community, not a suburban dictatorship. Arthur Jenkins, surprisingly, was elected as the interim president, and he proved to be far more capable and fair-minded when not operating under Mildred's oppressive thumb. He even publicly apologized to me for the latter unpleasantness, as he delicately termed it. Life in Oakhaven improved dramatically. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. My heirloom roses, which I did eventually plant along the fence line just to complete the narrative, flourished, ironically untouched by any squirrels or raccoons. Perhaps the residual energy of justice kept them at bay. The fine wire deterrent remained, a silent guardian, but it never needed to deliver another jolt. Its legend was deterrent enough. Grandpa Joe came over for a celebratory barbecue a few months later. We sat on my patio, enjoying the sunset, the air free of airborne surveillance. "You know, son," he said, a proud smile on his face, "sometimes a little bit of targeted discomfort is all it takes to recalibrate an entire system." She just needed a clear signal that her interference was creating unacceptable resistance in the circuit. We clinked our beer bottles. It was a victory not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. We had faced down the HOA Karen, the queen of petty tyranny, and we had won, not through anger or aggression, but through careful planning, a bit of ingenuity, and the unshakable belief in our right to peace and privacy. The story of the electrified ladder became something of a local legend, whispered with knowing chuckles at block parties. Some versions exaggerated the voltage, others claimed Mildred's hair stood on end for a week. The truth was satisfying enough. And every time I looked at my beautiful, uninterrupted 6-foot cedar fence, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just a barrier. It was a symbol of boundaries respected, of a hard-won peace. So, there you have it. That's how a simple desire for privacy, a stubborn HOA president, and a genius grandpa with a knack for applied electronics turned my backyard into the epicenter of a suburban revolution. Was Grandpa a mischievous genius or a suburban vigilante? I'll let you decide. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about our electrifying solution. And if you've got your own HOA monster you've had to creatively outsmart, I definitely want to hear about it. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of when everyday folks get pushed just a little too far. And always remember, sometimes the best way to deal with a power trip is to, well, gently interrupt the power. Stay safe, and may your fences always be free of unwanted observers.